When I woke, I wasn't entirely sure if I was dead. The first thing I noticed was the warmth. It wasn't the searing heat you'd expect from a desert. No, it was a comfortable warmth, the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket, not too stifling but undeniably present. The air felt heavy, almost humid, but there was no moisture. And it was quiet. Too quiet. No breeze, no rustling of the earth, not even the distant hum of life. I sat up slowly, feeling a vague sense of disorientation as the fog hung around me, thick and silent like a shroud. The mist obscured the horizon, veiling everything beyond 100 feet or so. There was no sun, no stars, just a dull, gray light that seemed to seep from the very air itself, illuminating the desert in an eerie half-glow. I looked around, searching for something, anything, to anchor myself to. But there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of smooth, pale sand, stretching off into the haze. The desert looked cold, uninviting, but the warmth in the air was constant, unsettling. Where was I? How had I gotten here? I couldn't remember. I stood up, brushing the sand from my clothes, though I had no memory of lying down, let alone where I had been before this. My clothes were simple with jeans, a t-shirt, sneakers, nothing unusual, nothing that gave me any clue. I reached into my pockets, but they were empty. No wallet, no phone. Nothing. A knot of unease coiled in my stomach, but it wasn't panic. It was more like recognition. As though some part of me knew that this wasn't right, that the world wasn't as it had been. I took a step, then another. The sand crunched softly beneath my feet, the only sound in the vast emptiness. I walked, without any real purpose, simply because it seemed like the only thing to do. The fog pressed in on all sides, muffling everything, even my thoughts. The desert wasn't like any I had ever seen before. There were no dunes, no rocks, no landmarks to break the monotony. Just flat, featureless sand stretching out into infinity. And that fog, it was strange. It wasn't thick enough to block my vision entirely, but it was dense enough to distort it, making the distance seem both near and impossibly far at the same time. I walked for what felt like hours, though time didn't seem to have any real meaning here. The light never changed, the air stayed the same, warm and heavy, as if I were trapped in a moment that would never end. My footsteps continued, steady, rhythmic, but they felt more like echoes of a life that no longer existed. A life that I could barely remember. I kept walking, because there was nothing else to do. After what could have been minutes or days, I stopped. There was no change in the landscape, but I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. My skin prickled, though the warmth remained constant, soothing in a way that made the unease even worse. I turned, scanning the fog for any movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless, empty desert and the silence that pressed down like a weight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. The fog swallowed the sound almost immediately, as if it had never been spoken. No response. I shook my head, feeling the weight of the silence settling back over me. There was no one here. There couldn't be. The desert was empty, devoid of life. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the fog, watching me, waiting. I started walking again, my steps a little quicker now, my heartbeat picking up despite the oppressive calm that hung in the air. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving. The alternative, standing still in this desolate place, felt like surrender. And I couldn't surrender. Not yet. Time lost all meaning as I walked. The landscape never changed, the fog never lifted. It was as though I were trapped in an endless loop, walking the same stretch of desert over and over again, with no hope of escape. My legs ached, my throat was dry, but the air remained warm, almost humid, like the breath of some unseen presence pressing down on me. And still, that feeling of being watched never left. I started to wonder if I had always been here. If maybe this was my life now, an eternity spent wandering an endless desert, lost in the fog, forgotten by the world. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. I couldn't remember my name. I couldn't remember anything before the moment I had woken up in the sand. The thought gnawed at me, but it felt distant, like a memory from a dream I had long since forgotten. Suddenly, I stopped. There, in the distance, something moved. It was faint, barely a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was there. I strained my eyes, squinting against the fog, but I couldn't make out what it was. A shadow? A figure? It was impossible to tell. I hesitated, my feet rooted in place. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to go back the way I'd come. But there was no way back. There was nothing behind me, just more desert, more fog. So I took a step toward the shadow. Then another. As I moved closer, the shadow took shape. It was a figure, tall, unmoving, shrouded in the fog. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, and I found myself breaking into a run. The sand shifted beneath my feet, slowing me down, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach the figure. Desperate for some kind of answer. But as I got closer, the figure remained still. Unnervingly still. When I finally reached it, I stopped, breathing heavily. The figure wasn't a person. It was a pillar of stone, smooth and featureless, rising out of the sand like a monolith. It was about as tall as I was, and it jutted out of the ground at an angle, like it had been placed there deliberately, but there were no markings, no symbols. Nothing to suggest what it was or why it was here. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I touched the stone. It was warm to the touch, the same unnatural warmth that clung to the air around me. I pressed my palm against it, hoping for some kind of revelation, some spark of memory, but there was nothing. Just the smooth, warm surface beneath my fingers and the relentless silence. I pulled my hand away and took a step back, staring at the monolith in confusion. It was the only thing I had seen in this barren desert, but it told me nothing. There was no message, no meaning. Just emptiness. As I turned to walk away, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. A flicker of something familiar. A memory, maybe, but it was gone before I could grasp it. And then I heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a low hum, like the distant rumble of thunder or the murmur of voices just out of earshot. I turned, scanning the fog for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the desert, the monolith, and the endless, unchanging fog. But the sound grew louder, closer, as if something was approaching. My heart raced, and for the first time since I had woken up, I felt a surge of real fear. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it wasn't good. The hum became a roar, filling the air, drowning out my thoughts. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the sand, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog thickened, pressing in on me, suffocating me, but I kept running, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the roar stopped. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence returned, heavier than before, oppressive. I stood there, shaking, staring into the fog, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The desert was quiet once more, the fog thick and impenetrable, the warmth clinging to my skin like a second layer. I was alone again, lost in the silence. I took a deep breath and started walking once more. Maybe this was all there was. Maybe I would never know why I was here, or what had happened to the world I once knew. But I would keep walking. There was nothing else to do.